just wanted to talk to, I guess, the Secretary. You could start and ask anyone who's responsible for your public-facing webpage information to the public.
The department's webpage.
Yes. This is...
She doesn't have one.
Pardon?
Yeah,
when you said your, she worried for a minute, but she doesn't have one.
I certainly hope not.
And she said, do I have one? I don't know that I have one.
So, Secretary, if I look, for example, at the DFAT brief on Ukraine, it indicates a number of things that I think are somewhat misleading. The last entry under media releases and statements is the 25th of October 2023, and I'm assuming there have been many statements made about Ukraine since that date. I'm just wondering, what are your internal processes for checking that what you put on websites that informs the Australian people is actually current?
Senator Michael Growler, First Assistant Secretary, Strategic Communications Division. While my division is responsible for the posting to the web pages and our intranet, and that we obviously rely on colleagues from around the department to keep that updated in various ways. We do remind them quite regularly to keep an eye on that, but you may have identified an area where it's not kept up to date as much as possible.
So I'm sure if I asked Minister Wong whether Australians' commitments to Ukraine are only $780 million, she would tell me that that's incorrect, and there's been many things committed since that time, but that's what your website currently says.
Well, if that's what it currently says, you're right in saying it hasn't been updated.
Okay.
No one's rushing to the table to answer this, I noticed.
Which goes to the issue of internal checks and balances in terms of what is there, and I have had other departments in estimates where things have appeared on websites that were not actually the authorised policy of the departmental secretary or the authority in charge of that agency, because there were inadequate internal checks and balances. So as I go through this one, for example, it indicates that the last formal interaction of a senior Australian minister was the Prime Minister's visit to Ukraine. My reading of the media is that I think the Deputy Prime Minister was there far more recently.
Yes, of course he was. You're right.
So I could run through a long list here, but I won't. I think a brief browse of your webpage, but my question would be, what checks and balances do you have from a corporate governance perspective to make sure that the information Australians are relying on about our relationship with other nations, and particularly one like Ukraine, I would have thought would have been, it's had so much focus that if anything was going to be up to date. But as then businesses, for example, look for information about trade opportunities or other relations, or even things like sanctions, what confidence can the Australian people have that the information they're seeing is current?
I accept that the information on Ukraine and other policy matters does need to be up to date.
So my question, though, is what are your internal processes to make sure that is the case? Because clearly they have failed, relying, as Mr Growder said, on people just to drop us a line and keep us updated. Clearly doesn't work. So if an Australian company was trading with someone and it turned out the sanctions page was not up to date, then who's actually at fault? Would it be that Australian company or would it be DFAT? So what are your internal processes?
Right.
I think
sanctions, of course, are a very specific, very formal legal instrument which are in fact published systematically. So I can assure you that there is a very serious process run by Sanctions Office for those matters.
And I would hope there is, but
There
we would
is.
also hope that any information that a department of the government was putting up
That's
would be
fair
covered.
enough. But I'll ask Mr McLaughlin, perhaps in relation to sanctions where there is a legal effect or legal decision which has to be communicated.
Sure.
Excuse me. Would you mind repeating your question, just so I can be clear?
I was asking the Secretary, and I'll still come back to ask what are the internal processes and checks and balances in terms of scrutinising web pages, and I just used as an example that if a sanctions page was not up to date, who would be liable? Would it be the person who broke it, or would it be the department who had not updated it? No, I take the Secretary's word that perhaps that's not a good example, because if there is one thing that should be up to date, it would be sanctions, but it's just indicative of the fact there should be a process to make sure information is reasonably current. You know, I don't expect something that occurred this morning or yesterday, but a year or two out of date is probably not acceptable.
No, but I don't think you're suggesting that our sanctions pages are a year or two out of date.
No, I'm not, but that's not my point.
Just wanted to be clear, but I'll ask Ms Heckscher.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I would be concerned if our sanctions pages weren't up to date, and we take a great deal of care to update the sanctions consolidated list, because as you note, people rely on the consolidated list for checking and doing their own due diligence as to who might be listed. We do take a great deal of care and attention. Every time we list someone new, there is a legislative instrument that is published, and the consolidated list is updated as well. So we do absolutely check the sanctions lists are up to date, because we do rely on them, and so does the community, to check who might be listed and who might not be listed.
Sure, and I'm very glad to hear that. But Secretary, if you could come back to my core question, which was what are your internal processes for checking the validity of information which is put up on your website?
Well, we do have policy that requires geographic areas to keep website information current. You've drawn attention to an example where that hasn't happened. So I will assure you that I will make sure that we redouble our efforts for people to be aware of the policy and to do what they're supposed to do.
Well, perhaps you could take on notice to come back to the committee with the results of any audits you do across your pages and actions that you take to make sure that that kind of lag doesn't occur again. If you're happy to take that on notice.
Well, I don't know about audit, but we'll make sure
How else would you determine...
Well, it's up to the Secretary and the department to work out how to deal with it, but why don't we say we will take on notice what actions are being taken to try and improve the accuracy of the website?
I would be happy with that if you could come back to the committee and advise us of those actions. Thank you.